The Guardian.
Hi, welcome to Science Weekly. The team is taking a short summer holiday, and while they do, we're digging into the archive to bring you some of our favourite and most relevant episodes. This one is from a couple of years ago and explores the psychology of climate change denial. Back then, Donald Trump was on the brink of inauguration and would go on to announce the US withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement. 2.5 years later, and there remains overwhelming scientific evidence of the catastrophic effects of global heating. But it would appear there's still a way to go to convince people of the urgency of the issue, despite recent campaigns by the likes of Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg. Here at The Guardian, we announced that the newspaper would change the language it uses to talk about the environment. You've probably noticed this already. We used to talk about climate change, global warming and climate skeptics. Now we talk about the climate crisis, global heating and deniers. Language really does matter, but it's just one of the aspects that scientists and journalists should think about when they communicate about the climate crisis, especially to people who vehemently deny that it even exists. So, enjoy the show.
Well, I'm not a big believer in man-made climate change. There could be some impact, but I don't believe it's a devastating impact.
In 2012, Trump claimed that human-induced climate change was no more than a hoax, tweeting, "The concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make US manufacturing non-competitive." The tweet has now been shared over 100,000 times, perhaps indicating that Trump is not alone in his beliefs. But what is the psychology behind climate change denial? How can it be overcome? And what can scientists learn from political campaigns about the best ways to get their message across?
Climate has changed, but they used to call it global warming. They've had many different, they call it extreme weather. They always change the name to encapsulate everything. The problem we have is our businesses are suffering. Our businesses are unable to compete in this country because other countries aren't being forced to do what our businesses are being forced to do.
I'm Ian Sample. This is Science Weekly.
I feel very strongly about it, and I feel that it puts us at a great economic disadvantage for jobs and other things.
In 2015, a scientific study found that the consensus on anthropogenic global warming among publishing scientists in the 2 years beforehand was over 99.99%. Only 4 of the 69,406 authors rejected anthropogenic global warming, meaning the US House of Representatives held 40 times more global warming rejectors.
It is beyond my comprehension how we can elect the President of the United States, somebody like Trump, who believes that climate change is a hoax invented by the Chinese. Bottom line is...
It's not just politicians, of course, who can turn their backs on scientific evidence. While a Pew Research Centre report last year found that majorities in 40 polled nations agreed that climate change was a serious problem, plenty still reject the idea and see no reason to take action.
A fantastic scientist who believes in empirical evidence is quoting consensus.
Can I just say, I brought the graph, right? I mean, can I
First of all, that the data has been corrupted, and we know that the 1930s were wrong with it today.
Yeah, corrupted. What do you mean corrupted?
Been manipulated
By
NASA. By the CIA, yes.
It's as if there's something in human psychology that makes climate change hard to fathom.
Hello.
Hi.
This is Dabika Shome.
So my name is Dabika Shome. In 2009, I was a co-author of The Psychology of Climate Change Communication, which came out of the Center for Research on Environmental Decisions, also known as CRED, at Columbia University.
We spoke to Dabika via Skype and started by asking her why climate change can be so hard for some of us to take on board.
Climate change has a number of factors that make it difficult to understand and difficult to explain. One of those is that it's geographically and temporally distant. That means that many people don't feel like they are personally impacted by it. It feels like it's something that's happening to people far away and, way off in the future as well. Another thing that makes it difficult to understand is that it's often steeped in scientific jargon and precision around conveying uncertainty that can lead to confusion and misunderstanding by the general public. And I think the third thing that makes it really difficult is that the human brain isn't necessarily designed to immediately react to threats that seem to be in the distant future, like climate change. And so there's two different processing systems that the brain uses, the experiential and the analytic. And experiential processing is very much about survival behavior, and it's the source of emotions and instincts. And so it really reacts to images and stories, whereas the analytic processing system controls analysis of scientific information. And while experiential processing systems are the stronger motivator for action, most climate change communication is geared towards that analytic processing system, the charts and the graphs and the numbers and the probabilities that all of us are so familiar with. So all of those factors combined make it difficult to convey the sense of urgency with climate change, to connect with audiences, to have them understand the issue, and to ultimately feel a personal connection to climate change.
As Debika explains, many of these are mediated by specific cognitive biases, the first of which is known as confirmation bias.
The confirmation bias is when you're looking for information that's consistent with what you already think or want or feel. And so that leads people to end up avoiding or dismissing or just ignoring information that requires them to change their mind or their behavior. And that's because change is hard, right? We don't want to have to change. We want to look for the things that are in line with what we already feel. And so this can make us susceptible and lead people to misinterpret scientific data. So another cognitive bias that we've seen is loss aversion. And loss aversion is this feeling that people have that they want to avoid losses rather than seek gains. And so changes that make things worse loom larger than improvements or gains. So you'd rather avoid losing $100 that you already have than gain a new $100. And so those negative feelings associated with losing those $100 would outweigh the positive feelings associated with gaining $100. So when it comes to climate change, this may make people more likely to adopt environmentally friendly behaviors if they believe that their way of life is threatened and that inaction will result in even greater loss.
These biases all come together to form what are known as mental models.
Yeah, so a mental model is a person's thought process for how something works. We all have mental models, and we have many of them that we're creating throughout our lives, and they're often made up of facts and incomplete information, past experiences, intuition, your gut. All of that is necessary to take all of this information in and process it so that you can move forward and shape your actions and your behavior. And so they serve as this framework that people use to fit new information into processes. And so they are something that can be altered. They're not static. People can update them with correct information, new information. They can make new connections with existing knowledge that they have. And so when we're talking about climate change information, it's important to try to understand what kinds of misconceptions your audiences may have around their mental model so that you can then use that information to replace it with new information. One example that one of the researchers at CRED had from a research study he did was around confusion around the ozone layer and climate change. And so people in their mental models conflated the ozone layer with how the atmosphere works. And so they connected the ozone layer with how greenhouse gases were accumulating in the atmosphere. And they were thinking that the hole in the ozone layer was either a good thing for climate change or a bad thing for climate change, meaning that there could also be a hole in the greenhouse gas effect. And so this led to the construction of an inaccurate mental model about the causes of climate change. And so if you were a climate change communicator, there would be a need to really replace this mistaken model with correct information if your audience had information about the ozone layer and greenhouse gases that was incorrect.
In this way, the key to effective communication of complex issues, such as climate change, comes with knowing your audience and then tailoring a message that will appeal to them, otherwise known as framing.
Framing is when you set an issue within an appropriate context to achieve a desired interpretation or perspective. The intention is never to deceive or to manipulate people, but to make things like climate science more accessible to the public. Since it's impossible not to frame an issue, you need to ensure that you're consciously selecting a frame that resonates with your audience. You know, you might want to talk to groups that share a certain geography or an occupation or an age or a culture or a hobby in a different way. An audience in Colorado in the US might identify more strongly with links between climate change and the ski industry, while an audience in Florida may care about climate change and sea level rise. A group of college students might want to focus on green jobs, while a group of seniors may care about the long-term implications for climate change on their grandchildren. One important thing to remember is that you don't want to focus so intently on any one particular aspect of an audience or a frame that you lose sight of the bigger picture.
But it's not just individuals who play a role in the global fight against climate change. Industry must also take heed.
Sound check, can you tell me how is Costa Rica?
Absolutely fantastic.
This is Tima Bansal.
I'm Tima Bansal. I'm a professor at the Ivey Business School at Western University in London, Canada.
We spoke to Tima via Skype and first asked her about the role corporations play.
So there's two ways in which corporations contribute to climate change. One way is through fueling the desire for stuff, right? So it's the marketing of what companies do. And it's become a very material world. And the second way that they do it is through just their emissions and the production of that stuff. And I think that until we understand that corporations are willing to make the investments in low carbon technologies, because there's very little incentive for them to do so, and because it requires these long-term commitments, that we'll never be really able to deal with the carbon problem or climate change. And so we need to deal with this inherent tendency for corporations to prefer the short-term investments, which means that they will not make the investments in low-carbon technologies.
Something Tima believes stems from what is known as short-termism.
And short-termism is a preference of short-term returns at the cost of long-term returns. So these are organizations that say, I'll take a little less money now in terms relative to the money that I'd make over the long term. And so ultimately you think, well, why would they do that? And there's a couple of reasons. You ask, where does it lie in organizations? It lies at the individual level. So this is the level of the managers. They prefer returns now over returns later, and that's just human nature. It's around instant gratification, so that you just rather eat your cake than wait for it, right? So you'd rather have money now than money later. So there is a psychological bias towards short-termism. Walter Mischel talks about the marshmallow experiment, where kids were given the opportunity to have one marshmallow now or two marshmallows later, and the majority of them prefer to have one marshmallow now. So if this is children, it doesn't really change as you get older. So there's this notion of instant gratification that plays into it. There's also, though, this more business orientation that managers do not like to show losses. And so there's a study that was done by Grahams, Harvey, and Raj Gopal in 2003, where they showed that 78% of the managers that they surveyed would prefer to forego long-term earnings in order to have short-term returns. And so right away, managers would prefer to smooth out the current losses. So that's at the managerial level. And then at the organizational level, of course, managers make decisions for organizations, but organizations in general do not like uncertainty. And so when they face uncertainty, they would rather have their earnings now because they don't know if they're going to have their earnings in the future. And so what we're seeing in more recent years is a lot more uncertainty, more turbulence in financial markets, as financial markets become a lot more complex, as in a complex system. So what happens in Asia affects us in North America. What happens in the American elections will affect worldwide markets. And even when a president tweets, we can expect turbulence in the markets. And so the turbulence is starting to be escalated in financial markets.
So should our efforts be aimed solely at corporations then?
The climate change conversation is really focused on individuals and government. So on the one hand, we expect government to really have public policy to make those changes. Or we expect the individuals, people, to be motivated or activated into doing something. But climate change ultimately is this really massive scale, long-term issue. And so we need governments to act, and if governments don't act, then we need people to act, but really people don't have an incentive to act because they don't actually feel individually the impact that they make, right? Corporations, to me, are really the lever for climate action. And if there's one way that we can make significant change on the climate change portfolio, it's to somehow motivate companies to do that. Then the question is, what are the motivators? And then we do get back to individuals and governments, but we don't need all individuals to turn off their lights or stop driving their cars or whatever it is. All we need is a handful of truly motivated people to make the lives of business miserable, so that businesses are then forced to act. And then we need government to set in place public policy that will allow for greater certainty into the future. And so it's actually easier to get corporations to act than it is to get the massive civil society to act, or to get all governments to agree on an accord. So it's actually quite possible to get corporations to be leaders in this change.
With Donald Trump at the helm, many believe this complex and delicate web of individuals, governments and corporations may take on a whole new and dire form.
I think that there'll be little change here. It'll go up, it'll get a little cooler, it'll get a little warmer like it always has for millions of years. It'll get cooler, it'll get warmer. It's called weather.
Coming up after this short break, we ask what significant changes can scientists make to improve their messages?
If I had to choose one thing, it would be storytelling and humanizing climate change.
And what can we learn from the world of political campaigning?
There is a communications challenge to think very carefully about not just what the facts are and what we as campaigners and communicators feel strongly about, but what is going to move the needle with the people we actually need to reach.
We'll be right back.
I'm Emma John, and I'm sorry. I lied to you.
It's the spin!
I said we'd be happy if England won the World Cup, but lost the Ashes. It's not true. I want it all. I know it's greedy, but positioning the urn next to the World Cup on Ben Stokes' mantelpiece would make this the ultimate summer for English cricket. So join us on the spin as we turn ourselves into emotional wrecks all over again. It couldn't be as nerve-wracking as the World Cup final. Could it?
It's the spin!
The Spin is supported by NatWest.
I've received, a lot of people don't know this, I've received many environmental awards, many environmental awards for the work I do. And I believe strongly in clean water and clean air. But I don't believe that what they say, I think it's a big scam for a lot of people to make a lot of money.
Welcome back to Science Weekly. I'm Ian Sample. Before the break, we heard about some of the psychological barriers to effective communication of climate change, both on an individual and corporate level. But climate change has become so much more than just a scientific issue. It just sounds like it's ringing. Are you ringing? Okay.
Hello?
Hi, is that Matthew? To find out about the more politicised elements of climate change, I spoke to Matthew McGregor.
I'm Matthew McGregor. I'm the director of the digital team at Precision Strategies, which is a company based in the US that came out of the Obama 2012 campaign. That's a campaign I worked on the digital team working in rapid response. So my team and I were responsible for trying to rebut Mitt Romney's campaign and define the offer he was making to the American people, if you like. So videos and tweets and Facebook posts and blog posts about where he was wrong on many things. And, you know, I don't come to this with any particular expertise in climate change. It's something I care about, obviously, but not something I've worked on. My expertise is limited to a D at GCSE science and what I've read in newspapers like The Guardian. So it's an interesting discussion for me as someone who's coming at this very much from the outside.
But you come to this then as someone who has their expertise in digital communications and these kinds of strategies for getting messages across. So if you were asked to help make people care about climate change, where would you even start?
It's a great question. I think that it's important to start from a perspective of where things really are. I think that people involved in climate change campaigning are probably very frustrated and disappointed about where things are at. There's obviously a crisis situation, and it's not the number one topic in a way that maybe is justified. But, you know, advances have happened. I think the Paris Agreement is seems to me to be a big step forward. It's not the number one item on everyone's agenda, but the candidate with a comprehensive plan to tackle climate change just got the most votes by a very long way in the US presidential election. Obviously not actually winning the Electoral College, but still, in terms of public opinion, it's a signifier that we shouldn't discount just because we're depressed about the actual outcome of the Electoral College. So it's important to recognise that climate change campaigners have done a huge amount to put it on both the government agenda, but also on public opinion. But, you know, I think that the thing for me is that on these kinds of topics, there isn't one big moment or one big campaign that will be the thing that breaks through. That's just not how communications work. It's not how history works, in my view. I think it will be lots and lots of little things, embedding climate change and the things that we need to do to tackle climate change into the day-to-day discussions that people have. Climate change communications doesn't necessarily have to be about climate change itself. It's also about jobs. It's also about health and healthcare. It's also about sustainable and healthy, happy living environments. And so I think in those sort of individual ways, through emotional frames that connect with people's day-to-day experiences, there's a kind of almost a laundering effort that needs to take place to embed the climate change issue in everything else that is being talked about and is the focus of people's individual lives. I kind of feel like this is a topic where that we kind of won the political argument and the factual case, but the moral and the practical case is one that is not discussed enough and is not embedded in all of the other things that go on in people's lives. It's kind of off to one side as an important but never a priority issue.
With his extensive background in digital political campaigns, I asked Matthew what might be learnt from the kinds of strategies he and his colleagues have used so effectively to get people to vote.
You know, the thing that I always try to think about with digital campaigning is that people aren't coming to watch a video or read a blog post or look at something on Facebook because they're interested in the message that I'm trying to get across. They're looking to be entertained or moved or to learn something. And so when we are thinking about how we talk about these topics, you know, I always say less is more. Less spin is more reach. If you aren't shoving something down somebody's throat, they're much more likely to be interested in consuming that piece of content. And so trying to be funny, trying to be interesting, trying to connect real people's stories with the everyday experience of the people you're trying to reach. Those are all things to do. I mean, it's difficult when you, when you're trying to run campaigns, you are focused on the internal audience of your boss and the donors and, decision makers internally in your organization. It's very difficult to put a priority the interests of people who are clicking, who primarily want to be amused for 5 minutes in between the thing that they should be doing and the next thing they have to do. So to me, it's less about tools and platforms and more about the kind of ethos of putting the consumer of our content first, and that's just a tricky tricky thing to do. This is a topic, an issue where things are fairly apocalyptic and terrifying, and there's always a temptation to be very aggressive, very frightened, to communicate the frightening situation in which we find ourselves in. That's just not how people live their lives. People have got their own challenges. They are tired, they are busy, they are stressed at work, and we can only get to them bit by bit by bit, not in one big foul swoop.
You've just touched on this, but I was wondering whether there is a thinking that it's best to focus on the good outcomes that can be achieved from a certain action, or the bad outcomes that can come about if you don't do something. And obviously with climate change, you have both. You can focus on, if you do this, then, I suppose the world will feel a little bit better and you can feel smug. If you don't do it, then, Armageddon and all the other kinds of, frightening things people talk about. I mean, do you have to do both, or can one focus on one or the other? Are the audiences more receptive to one or the other?
I think on the whole, people are more receptive to positive outcomes and positive rewards. I always think back to the Bob Geldof moment in the early 80s, where he was on TV saying, "Give us your effing money, don't go to the pub." And it's quite a famous TV moment. It was a successful campaign then, but I don't think that's the right approach. I want to go to the pub. Going to the pub is great, and I don't want to not do that. And so I think that, the more you can say to people that there will be positive outcomes, this isn't about sacrifice, and there are positive outcomes to tackling climate change in jobs and health. And it's important that we give people that vision of a better tomorrow. But, both of those things are important. It's important not to mislead people. It's not important not to pretend that, nothing bad is happening. Something bad is happening. It's just a communications challenge of which levers you use at any particular moment.
So it's important for messages to be anchored in facts, but facts are only a part of the picture.
It is not enough for us to be right. We have a lot of facts. We have a lot of statistics. We have a lot of reports. And it hasn't got us anywhere. And I think that, sometimes we have tried to, be the smarty pants, be the cleverest person in the room, and to win an argument. But, those the kind of people that you didn't want to be friends with at school. And we often are kind of bogged down in our own rightness, and have not thought carefully about what actually connects with people, what actually persuades people, what actually moves people to come with us and to take action. And so I think that there are examples of that kind of talking down to people that I think have to be avoided. I don't want anyone to think that I'm somehow against facts. Of course, facts are important in how you govern and in decisions that you take and the policies that you want to pursue and the changes we need to make. But it's not enough to be right. We have to think about the things that will actually bring people with us.
When it comes to climate change, it's not just about winning over the equivalent of swing voters, those people who simply haven't made up their minds yet. There are still plenty of climate change deniers. How much should a communication strategy be aimed at them? What about taking on the opposition? I mean, obviously, when you were in Chicago for the Obama campaign, you had Mitt Romney firmly in your sights. Do you have to take on the opposition? And I suppose for people who would want to do some kind of climate change campaigning, they would see the opposition as being, I suppose, climate skeptics, maybe even Trump himself. Is that an essential part of a strategy?
Helping to run an opposition campaign against Mitt Romney feels slightly quaint now in this new era of Donald Trump. All of the things that we thought Mitt Romney was terrible at, I mean, he was bad. He would have been a bad president, but it just feels a little quaint now. But I mean, one thing I would say about that is that, I had a team of 6-7 people who were focused day in, day out on Mitt Romney, the digital team, just the digital team. The digital team as a whole was 300 people, the rest of whom were all focused on the positive arguments, the mobilization of our supporters, the crowdfunding to sustain the campaign. We got a lot of attention because our work was quite hard-hitting, lots of it was funny, kind of catnipy kind of content. But it was a very small part of the overall plan. And I think that's an important thing to take away for a lot of campaigns. you have to have a positive agenda and a positive and compelling way to communicate that agenda. I also think that on the whole, climate change campaigners have won that culture war. The opposition oil companies, fossil fuel companies are seen negatively by the overwhelming portions of voters, and people understand that there is an issue. It's just that it's that both not risen up the agenda enough to pressure politicians enough, and power structures are such that we're outgunned by the Koch brothers of the world. So I think it's important to do opposition campaigning. I think it's important to explain and raise up the issues of the contrast between the brighter future we can have and the changes that we need to make versus the kind of economy and societal structure that the old way of doing things gives us. But it has to be, I think, a small part of the overall narrative that we're trying to present to people.
Just finally, Matthew, and I'll let you get on, is we know there's a lot of concern among climate scientists all over the world, but certainly in the US around Trump coming in as the next president. From your sense of what you've seen so far, does he look like a man who might listen to lowly scientists?
No, unfortunately not. I mean, Donald Trump is, I think, somebody who has not thought deeply about his worldview. At the moment, there is a fire hose of horror coming out from him, and that includes climate change and ranges across a whole range of other issues. He is personally, I think, someone who has not got a detailed and well thought through worldview. But he is surrounding himself with people who do and have a very reactionary and conservative stance on climate change and on a whole range of other issues. I think that one of the challenges that campaigners will have over the next few months and years is to understand who is actually driving policy out of the administration. Donald Trump is obviously the ultimate decision maker as president, but he's somebody I don't think thinks very deeply about these things, and he is surrounded by advisors who do. He has a Republican Congress that does, and he is appointing people into places like the EPA or the UN that will have an influence. And I think on climate change, on national security, on foreign policy, on a whole range of issues, there's a real challenge to understand who is actually driving some of these decisions. I think on the whole, we do not yet fully understand and cannot grasp how bad the next 4 years will be. And I think it's important to have our eyes wide open about that.
But when it comes to climate change specifically and the effective communication thereof, is there a glimmer of hope in a world with President Donald Trump at the helm? First up, Tima Banzel.
Without speaking to Trump specifically, from a corporate perspective, if they want certainty, and the more certainty that they have, the more likely that they will make the investments that are needed to deal with these big world issues. And I think many, many corporations want that. Then in an environment where the government does not provide that certainty, and that each day provides more uncertainty by the government actions, I think that is going to create an environment for business that's going to make it more challenging than ever to deal with climate change.
I am optimistic about the future.
Dabika Shome again.
I've seen powerful examples around the world and in the US on how governments, whether at a national or a state or a local level, or companies or local communities, are coming together to take action around climate change. I've also been focusing a lot on understanding the greater ecosystems that are at play, working in partnership to address this huge, complex, multi-generational issue. I think acceptance is going to increase as people start to see climate change around the world, but also when they start seeing it increasingly in the US, affecting them and affecting them locally. people understand climate change based on their own experiences and their connections to the issue. So I think more of that local connection in the future is going to make acceptance more likely as well.
Special thanks this week to Devika Shome, Tima Bansal and Matthew McGregor. This special episode of Science Weekly ties in with The Guardian's Global Warming, a live digital event. To find out more and explore the rest of our content, head over to theguardian.com. I'm Ian Sample. This is Science Weekly.
For more great podcasts from The Guardian, just go to theguardian.com/podcasts.